Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to day 3 of our symposium. Quite an exciting day we've got planned, so that today together we will go through some very, very informative and interactive sessions. First up this morning, and following through on the presentations of the last 2 days, we embark on phase 1 of the passenger journey. Evidence of identity and trusted documents. This afternoon in phase 2 of the passenger journey, we look at pre-departure arrival passenger data exchange. This will be the theme of the interactive sessions led by Vijay Punusamy. And we do hope you've had the opportunity to do your homework. That is, to review the presentations that will be made this afternoon. If you haven't had the opportunity yet, you can still squeeze them in, I suppose, at lunchtime. It would be great because it would infuse the interactive session, the discussions, with knowledge of the matter that the different presenters will be sharing with us. And you can review the presentations on the symposium website. Before we get underway this morning, I'd like to sincerely thank SIGPA for sponsoring the networking reception last night. Again, it was a tremendous opportunity for all of us to get together, share stories, experiences, network, and visit again the booths of our different sponsors and exhibitors. I'd also like to mention that we have an all-day networking coffee available to all of you today. It's on the 5th floor. And it is sponsored today by Get Group. Third point is, during the presentation this morning and throughout the day, you will have access, I should say, to the website and the email system to put questions and comments to our panelists. You can do so, and we'll remind you a few times as we go through the day. The address for sending in questions and comments is tripsymposium@icao.int. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for the first panel of this session, Mr. Stephen Chapman. Steve is a member of the ICAO Implementation and Capacity Building Working Group. Steve has had the role of International Relations Manager for Her Majesty's Passport Office since 2007. He represents the Passport Office at ICAO and EU meetings and is active bilaterally on sharing information on travel document policy, best practices, and technology. Prior to that, Stephen has worked in various UK government departments over his 30-year career, covering topics as diverse as the Millennium celebrations, welfare benefits, and international trade. So, Steve, we're looking forward to your presentation, to your expert handling, I should say, of the session this morning. He's blushing already, isn't that nice? Okay, Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Denny. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see so many of you here bright and early. Hopefully you've been taking advantage of the coffee. So I'm going to introduce this session and then we'll move on to our 3 presenters. Unfortunately, we were due to have a 4th presenter, but he's just been unable to make it. So our apologies for that, but I'm sure you're going to agree it's going to be a really interesting, useful session for you. I'll remind you again, please, whilst the presentations are going on, if there's anything you'd like to ask, email us to the address that Denny's just given you, tripsymposium@icao.int, and then I'll try and read them out once we get to the end of the presentations, and we'll get you the answers you need. So, to introduce, excuse me while I put my glasses on, age is getting to me now. So this session is supporting improved national identity management practices. Both technology and generational changes are likely to have an impact on how legal identity could be packaged and shared in the future. Already, smartphones are capable of unambiguously verifying physical identity using biometrics stored in interconnected central registry ecosystem. Automation allows for credible evidence of identity involving the tracing, linkage, and verification of identity against source documents to ensure the authenticity of identity. So we have 3 presenters for you today. The first presenter I'll introduce is Annette Beyer-Forsingdal. I hope I got that right. Now, Annette is a fascinating person. She's currently Senior Program Specialist at Centre of Excellence for CRVS Systems with IDRC in Ottawa. That's the International Development Research Centre here. Prior to her appointment, she was a director for the Directorate of National Population Register, Identification and Production under the Department of Civil Registration, Ministry of Home Affairs and Immigration in Namibia. She worked for the Ministry of Home Affairs and Immigration in Namibia for 9 years. During tenure in the Ministry of Home Affairs and Immigration, she led the multiple reform projects successfully, including the opening of hospital-based facilities and the introduction of a new and integrated web-based national population registration system, hosting all civil records, including the ID record, under one demographic profile. Annette has a master's degree in history from the University of Copenhagen and bachelor degree in history and sociology from the University of Copenhagen as well. Please welcome Annette for her presentation. And please remember, if you hear anything that's really interesting you want to ask, please submit your emails to the email address I've just given you. I'm not going to repeat it again because you should know it by now. Okay. That's your test to make sure you've been listening. If you don't know it, you can't ask. So, Annette, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stephen. And thank you, Matt. First, I would like to thank you for inviting me and IDRC here today to speak about the importance of civil registration to facilitation of lawful immigration. So, I'm very honored to be here. It's a new platform. Normally I'm speaking on the big civil registration and ID platforms. So I'm coming from the Center of Excellence that is based or hosted under the IDRC in Ottawa. So if we can, I have to move my presentation there, so. Okay. So first of all, I want to speak about why is civil registration and vital statistics, including ID system, why are they so important and what is the key principles? And why is it important to adopt holistic and human-centered approaches when you build this system? And in the end, how does this all link to immigration and migration? So, what is the definition of civil registration? I always start there because basically it also outlines the most key principles for when you're building these systems. So it's basically the continuous, permanent, and compulsory and universal recording of vital events. And vital events is birth, marriage, death, divorces, adoptions. There's also other principles that is important when you build this system, and it has to be timeless. You cannot register an event 10 years after it occurred. It should happen immediately after it. I will speak more to that. It needs to be accurate, and then again, it needs to be trustworthy. We need to be able to trust whatever goes into these systems because such things as immigration system relies on the information that is added. All this data that goes into these systems can also be used to produce, or basically the best source for production of vital statistics, which more broadly can be understood as demographic statistics. And this is a picture from when I was in Namibia and we introduced the e-birth notification system, which is basically a notification system where a birth is notified immediately after it occurred in order to establishing a child's identity. Okay, so I've drawn up this for you to understand what is the flow and what should be a flow in a civil registration system. It all starts with a notification. Somebody needs to notify the Registrar General that an event has occurred. Then you have the registration and validation, and then in the end, the certification. So the notification can come from multiple different institutions. So when a birth occurs, Home Affairs or other institution where the civil registration authorities falls under need to be notified this event has occurred. Otherwise, they don't know about the event before the parents present themselves. But you also need to identify the mother. So what you need to do is that it needs to be interlinked with the register. So when I now appear as the mother at the hospital, I need to be identified. My identity needs to be identified up against the civil register, and then the detail of my baby needs to be recorded. That is the foundation for the establishment of this child. When the child is now brought to the civil register, the legal part happens. That's when the name is established, probably an ID number is issued, the paternity is established, and in many cases, citizenship. So all these vital events, could also be death, marriage, fetal death, ID, all goes into a central database, which is called the civil registration system, can be interoperable with the ID system. So it all lies there together. All this data can now be used for other functional database to validate. So every time, for example, you need to apply for a passport, it needs to be validated up against that database. So one of the things that came to my mind was, how do we bridge this gap of manual and digital systems? I think it's very important when we build civil registration systems. It's not like an easy job, or it's a very long-term process, and you need to have functional systems. You cannot just come in and build a digital system. You need to do it in a well-functioning kind of environment. So first of all, as you saw, it's a very, very big system, and there's a lot of stakeholders and a lot of people involved in it. So you need to have a vision, you need to have a strategy that basically covers the whole landscape. This Minister of Health, Minister of Justice, it's the police in some cases, and then obviously the Civil Registration Authority, it's also the statisticians and all the different institutions that relies on your data to authenticate the person. So you need to have a big vision, you need to have a strategy, you need to have the political will. Then you have to have a functioning organization where you ensure access to your services. It needs to be universal. This is for all. You cannot say that it's people's vital events that should not be registered. You need to have a legal framework that guides this, and you need to have seamless processes. If you don't have seamless processes, there might be a risk of people not coming forward. Then you need to collaborate. I've spoken about that already. You need to have human resources that can actually do these registration in an accurate manner. Have to build the capacity. And then one of the things I think is overseen is the universal demand. How do you create demand for your services? There must be some kind of a purpose for the individual to actually go and register. And this has been one of the biggest challenges in Namibia and many African countries, that people don't see a purpose for registering. Why should I pay a lot of money to go and register my child if I don't get any direct benefit? So you do see that in countries where there is good welfare systems and benefits, there's much higher registration rate. You can see that in Namibia, you can see in South Africa and Botswana, and that's all linked to these social protection systems. And then the whole digitalization comes. There's no proof, according to me, that digitalization actually guaranteed a universal coverage of birth registration. This is all the other things that is there. That is accessibility, that you have people who can tackle all these complicated cases. It's not always digitalization. There's many bit of benefits to it, but it's not a single factor. And then you have to deal with all your legacy documents. Those documents also need to be now entered into these systems, otherwise they're worthless, because you need all the time to validate a new birth up against the parents, because your citizenship is established by your parents and your, okay. So here, so this is, if you want, so if we now try to link it to lawful migration, what do you need to make sure in order to have secure passport issued? You need to make sure that you have a notification from the moment of birth, the mother, and it must be linked to the mother. Then you have to make sure that the birth is registered, and if the child is not having citizenship in the state where it's born, that citizenship is established through descent, or maybe if the person is stateless through a different procedures. Then you need to, in some cases, issue, it's not all countries has got it, an ID number. You can only take biometrics from around 12 years old. And then you have to guarantee that this person is still alive. And that's why you need to have a holistic approach, because if you don't know, if the person is still alive, I could basically turn up with somebody else's birth certificate. So this is the process prior to the issuance of a passport. And obviously, the passport database is one of the functional databases that is linked to the civil registration system. So for example, if you apply for a passport in Namibia, they validate up against the birth register and the ID register who you are, and then they basically just migrate all your data into the passport system. That also secures the accuracy, that there's no spelling mistake. The single truth, as it's said so many times now, lies only in the civil register. You cannot have multiple identities. So where is the biggest challenge? The biggest challenge lie here. You can see my red star thing. That is the fact that people are not registering these events in a timely manner. That's what breaks down the systems. If I, as an adult, can apply for a birth certificate and an ID, my identity must be established by birth, because otherwise I can exist on multiple identities, and it can be difficult for the passport and immigration to authorities to actually validate it, because you so much rely that the truth lies in the civil registration. Okay, so there's many dimensions to CRVS and civil registration. So one of the other things that we work with is obviously also the human right dimensions. Everybody has a right to a name from birth, everybody has a right to nationality, to be registered in front of the law. If your birth is not registered, you don't have a legal identity, and then you have a right to live in dignity. That also means that you have the right to move in a lawful manner. Then there's the data dimension. All these systems, if they're built correctly, you have a lot of generation of data. So you will see countries that basically base their censuses up on their civil registration systems, which obviously can be used for policy and planning. Then you have the gender dimension, where you can now ensure, for example, child marriage. Women are not getting married too early, if you have laws about that. And you can also get a lot of data that can protect girls. Then you have the administrative dimension of it, and that's to make sure that your social protection databases are updated and correct and matches the names that is in your civil register. And of course, lastly, there is the security dimension, which is about authentication and validation of who we are. Okay, it's just to speak a little bit about who is the Center of Excellence that I'm now working for. So we basically a knowledge hub. So we generate knowledge about civil registration, and we have created a library where we have collected all the most important publications about civil registration. Then we are also part of general global engagement to steer the thought leadership. We do research, and in terms of research, we're mostly looking at what are the barriers for registration of vital events. We have a big project at the moment in Ethiopia, and we are also starting a project in Guinea. And then we do directly country engagement, where we together, for example, through UNICA, is giving technical support to different developing countries. This is our website if you're more interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annette. That was fascinating insight. My takeaways from that, I think there were, one of the slides there were some words that hit home: dignity, empower, fair, but also security. I think those are the things that that really came out for me from your presentation. Thank you very much for that. Now we're going to have Sanjay. Sanjay will be talking about moving source documents from paper to digital. The impact. Stay seated. I've still got to tell them how brilliant you are. That's just telling them what you're going to talk about, Sanjay. Hold on. Moving from paper to digital and the impact on travel identification. Now, Sanjay Dawadkar is currently head of Global ID Consultancy at WCC in the Netherlands, and has for, do you want me to say how many years? For over 30 years experience in identity and identification across Asia, Africa, and Europe. That's nearly half as long as Mike Holly's been doing this work, I think, actually. So, Mike? No, it's not listening. Excellent. Sanjay's current focus areas are civil registration, evidence of identity, electronic travel authorization, privacy, social footprint, biometrics, and biographics, especially for the EU, World Bank, as well as ICAO, where he participates at the Implementation and Capacity Building Working Group. He is also a member of ISO and CENTC technical standardization committees on the subject. He is currently engaged on the technical advisory group of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data for the United Nations. He represents WCC as advisory observer to the Secure Identity Alliance, and also works closely with OSCE ODIHR on review of the legal frameworks and identity management compendium. Sorry, I missed that word. Previously, in India, he worked on various UNICEF as well as the World Bank program. He is participant at the Hague Colloquium on the future of legal identity and writes regularly on the subject. So, please welcome Sanjay Dawadkar. I'm sure you're going to find his presentation fascinating. Sanjay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies. It's always a pleasure and privilege to be addressing this August Assembly, and thank you for inviting me to speak here. Taking off from Simon of OSCE's presentation yesterday, even though my name bears a very close resemblance to the Prime Minister of Ireland, I am not Irish. So, yeah, some of my starting slides are simple. This one gives the background where we come from. All has to tie in with the Chicago Convention and Annex 9. You've already heard about these particular documents, and at TRIP, our basic premise starts from the donut, which has these 5 different elements. And what I wish to show here is that all the other elements are well developed. There are a lot of documents, a lot of activities, a lot of paradigms built around them. Evidence of identity is an area of major concern, and a lot of development has to be done around this particular topic. In the previous presentations on this topic, we went into depth. Why is evidence of identity important? Because for example, one simple reason is the passport document has become increasingly strong. It's become more difficult to forge or counterfeit. So a lot of problems are around people assuming fake identities, and that is how they try to get into the system, and therefore evidence of identity becomes important. Why is it challenging? Because 200 countries have 200 different systems, they have 200 different histories, they have different ideologies, they have different administrative systems, and there's no common framework. So how does EOI work, and why does it make you worried? And how can you overcome this? Over the last few years, the ICBWG, one of the working groups which supports building up these kind of topics for ICAO, has spent a lot of effort and come up with the Guide on Evidence of Identity, which was released in May 2018. This is a public document. It is easy to download from the ICAO website. It's only about 50 to 60 pages, so it's not, it's easy to read from end to end, and it's very topical and practical. So it's easy to follow. So I've given the references here, you can download it. You remember how, if many of you have read Confucius, Confucius always made it simple, the 3 good ways or 8 terrible bosses. By giving that number, it makes it easy to remember. So the evidence of identity lists out 3 principles and 5 objectives. The 3 principles are that the identity should be genuine, the presenter links to the identity, and the presenter uses the claimed identity. So these are the principles which have to be kind of brought into play. And the objective is to establish that the identity exists. B, the identity is living. C, the person who is in front of you or whom you are dealing with or transacting with links to the identity. D, he is unique and the sole claimant. And lastly, the identity is used in the community. So these are the principles and objectives which the guide talks about, and it should be, then you can build your kind of paradigm around it. The ecosystem. What happens with identity, as I think we saw in the earlier presentation, governments and states have systems, and then there are other organizations which individuals deal with. And all these create a sense of identity for the person. So it's not only his birth certificate or his, registration of any of his vital events, but also maybe that he was issued a passport, or he has a phone number, or he has an email ID, or he has a driving license. So all this kind of creates a big ecosystem from which evidence about a person's identity can be drawn. Obviously, some will be more important, some will be more legitimate, but together it provides a good overall picture and can be kind of, you might have to resort to it or depend on it in different situations. This used to be, till last year, this used to be my most complicated diagram, but let me warn you that this is now one of the simpler ones. The ones coming after this are even more complicated than this. What it really shows is that as we kind of have progressed and tried to understand how to build up this overall framework for evidence of identity, you depend on, let's say, the civil registration system of the country. Then by foundation ID, you mean the national ID system where you might have the identity of the person and his biometrics. And then there are functional systems like maybe the income tax, maybe the electoral roll, maybe a welfare and pension system. So all these often need to be looked at together. And, then you arrive at, the kind of picture which we are talking about for the evidence of identity. And as these systems or blocks become more automated, we have to make sure that these are interoperable, which means the CRVS should be able to talk to the foundational ID system. The electoral roll must be able to talk to the CRVS, for example, to know if a person is eligible to vote or stand for a post in the country. And then beyond the systems, you also need other processes in place, like you might want to physically check, okay, this person lives in this part of the, at this address, or you might want to physically check that, he went to this school or, attended this university or works at this place. You might have to do interviews, for example, a refugee or an asylum seeker who arrives at your country without any documents. So you have to go through an elaborate interview process to, establish some of the parameters of the identity. So this is what, when looked at together, becomes the new evidence of identity process, which we need to put in place. That's that lovely picture from Escher. I belong to the Netherlands. Escher is one of the artists who used to draw these weird pictures, but it somehow looked very relevant here, so I put it here. And that is what we call the circle of trust, which means now you want to say that the identity is genuine, or the presenter links to the identity, or the presenter uses the identity, and you have three means. You have biometrics, you have the biographics, and you have the social footprint. So all these can kind of help you put this together and arrive at the overall picture of evidence of identity. So all this is fine. We make these beautiful policies, very coherent. It will be discussed in the parliaments, in the legislatures, and, the guidelines will be made. But what happens now at the, the window where this has to be transacted? So now you say that you cannot issue the passport till you first look at the birth certificate of a person. Today, manually, a lot of countries or in a lot of places, this is kind of enforced, but then this has problems. The first person who turns up in the morning says, yes, I'm eligible to get a passport in your country, but I wasn't born here. I was born in another country in which they never gave a birth certificate, but I have a letter from the principal of my school who says this is my age. So what does the person at the window do? Does he accept that as, a kind of legitimate evidence? Or does he have a backup where he can check that this is valid? In many countries, the problem is even simpler. There are 4,000 municipalities issuing birth certificates in different formats, and there is no way of knowing that this is a genuine one or is it a forged one. So the whole onus falls on, validating the birth record of a person. So as we move on, of course, there is the good news. For example, as one of the technical standardization committees, we saw that they are trying to standardize the birth registration record, which is in the European context, of course. And what we are trying to do is keep it in sync with the digital travel credential, the work going on DTC. So somehow at the end of it, they are both compatible, and you are able to kind of think of digitally looking at these two records together. And that might then help the process. Now this is actually my most complicated diagram, and I'm going to spend a bit of time. It looks simple, because when we say that civil registration needs to be tied up to, let's say, issuing or validating or renewing a travel document. Now, what is the simplest reason for this? If you are not yet born or you don't have a birth certificate, obviously it's too early to get a passport, you're not born. Or if you're already dead, then maybe it's too late to get a passport. So, but it becomes a little bit more complicated than that. I'm sure most of you are familiar. You have those very menacing, very tough-looking lawyers in your country, or the legal advisors who come and tell you, no, under common law this is not possible. Under civil law this is not possible. So all this gets tied up. Is your country a country which follows common law, or does it follow civil law, or does it have elements of religious law? Means a marriage is only recognized in a particular way. So, then that gives the legitimation to a child born. All those lot of things come into play. Even more complicated, how do you get onto that civil register? Is it that you're born and therefore you get onto it? It may not be that simple. Every country has its law. And some of the terms which we use to intimidate everybody is terms like just jus soli, which means of the soil. Were you born in the country? Or the other way to become a national of a country is that your parents were both nationals of the country. So all those principles have to be applied. And then, there are all the exceptions, that the mother was born in the country, but now she's living overseas, and, you were born overseas, but then you are, eligible to be on this particular civil registry. So all these laws come into play. Then next, as I think it has already been spoken by some of the speakers even yesterday and day before, no country has a perfect civil registration system, which means maybe only 3 out of 4 children. In fact, the world average is 3 out of 4 babies are registered. 1 baby is not registered. So how does that baby then go about proving? Or it sometimes, then you have to look at the ancillary records, like electoral roll. So what happens is that the dad goes to the member of parliament of his constituency and says, look, I've been voting for you for 15 years. And now they are saying that my child can't be registered. So I have proof here that I've lived in the country for 15 years. So how do you handle this? As Annette already pointed out, the important exceptions, like women. For example, you see, a marriage changes a woman's name. So now you have a birth certificate, and now she comes with a, the passport she wants in another name. She has to create yet another record, to show that she was married and this is how her name changed, etc. There are the cases of, for example, the stateless, people who have, as I said, many more stages to, show their legitimate evidence of identity. Where this is reflecting, for example, simple, very, very practical problem is the name inconsistencies. And this is already coming into things like API and PNR, which requires a name matching, and then you find that the name was put in a particular way, and the birth certificate has a name in a different way, and a passport has a name in a different way, and it's the same person. So all these are issues which are under current discussion, and I'm sure all of you would be able to identify with these problems and come up with solutions. And then, as I say, what do you do? Sorry, I hope I'm not taking too long. Just give a few more anecdotes. Okay, so what happens when you are not on any record, but here I am in person? So my African brothers here will remember this, that there are processes like where you sit in front of the tribal council, and if you can recite the name of your 7 ancestors, then you have a legitimate identity. I just have 2 more slides, if you don't mind.
You do a little bit.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. So, the overall legal framework of, how the travel document, I've tried to kind of unbundle it, because you have the travel documents itself, you have the visa and travel authentication, and you have API and PNR. So it stands at the crossroads between the international framework, which is encapsulated in the ICAO Annexure 9 and the UNSC resolutions, and then you have the national law pertaining to civil registration, civil identification, use of biometrics, criminal justice, because that is where, for example, the watch lists, or a person applies for a visa to your country, you might have to look at, so what are the laws which allow you to look up a person in a criminal database. And then, of course, privacy and data protection, and finally, electronic transactions, because a lot of this now, instead of on paper, it will get transacted electronically. And finally, I'll leave you to read these lines, but I'll just tell you probably two more things. Coming back to the Irish Prime Minister, his name is Varadkar, my name is Dharwadkar. So among the 1,000-odd naming surname conventions in India, Kar, the suffix, means you are from a particular place. So he's from Varad, I am from Dharwad. The places are barely 100 kilometers apart. But look at the difference in destiny. He's a Prime Minister, I am an ICAO expert. But being an evidence of identity expert, I also do feel like a backstop. So, and coming back, I think the real key point why all these things come under discussion is SDG 16.9, which I remember about 5 years back was, people nearly killed each other on that definition of legal identity with birth registration. And I think that is why all this is getting discussed. And with this, I think I would just like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.
As is. Very good news. Well, thank you, Sanjay. That was an excellent presentation, and we don't mind people going over a little bit when the content is so interesting. For me, I really want to commend the Evidence of Identity Guide that's been produced by the Capacity Building Working Group. The working group has actually produced quite a number of guides, and I really do encourage all states to have a look at them. Everyone has something to learn there. There's something that, although you may believe your state has a really good system already, from my experience, it's really good to know what other countries are doing and to see if something that you can do a little bit better, a little bit more efficient. There's always room for improvement. But moving on now to our third speaker is Seth Ayers from the World Bank. So stay there. It's good, excellent, because I have to tell them how good you are as well now. Seth is going to be talking about World Bank's Identification for Sustainable Development program. Seth is a senior program officer with the Identification for Development initiative at the World Bank Group. Launched in 2014, the initiative's mission is to enable all people to access services and exercise their rights by increasing the number of people who have secure, verifiable, and officially recognized IDs. To date, ID4D has worked with more than 45 countries and $1 billion, I take it that US dollars? Should really be in Canadian dollars as we're here, but we'll let that go. In active and pipeline financing in supporting implementation of digital ID and civil registration systems. Before joining World Bank Group, Seth was Standards Program Manager for IDEMA, an international trade organization that represents the US dollars 35 billion disk drive industry. Seth has been recognized for his work by the World Economic Forum as a member of the forum's Global Agenda Council on Data-Driven Development, as well as by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as a technical advisor. So, I'm expecting great things from this presentation from such an auspicious speaker. Seth. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to participate in the symposium. Okay, for my presentation, I'm going to cover 4 areas. The first, looking at identification from a development perspective and why the World Bank is interested in identification. The second is thinking a little bit about not just providing everyone globally with an ID, but also thinking about how that is done in a sustainable, trusted, and inclusive way, what we call a good ID. The third is around how we're seeing identification playing a key role as we see globally a shift to the digital economy, and why is ID so critical to that shift. And then the fourth is a bit of some thoughts going forward on areas that the World Bank is working around identification and maybe ways in which we could work with many of you as well. So before I go into the first slide, just a question for everybody out there. Would anybody like to guess at how many people globally cannot uniquely identify themselves currently? Anybody have a guess? Please just shout it out. How many? I heard somebody, I think, say 1 billion, which is indeed the actual number. So there's about 1 billion people globally who cannot uniquely identify themselves. About half of those people are in the sub-Saharan Africa region, and about half of the 500, or about half of that billion are also children. And so that's why Annette's presentation and the focus on CRVS, on registration of birth, are so important. So from a World Bank perspective, we focus not just on looking at what we would call sort of the stock, people that currently live and do not have an ID, as well as the flow. So as people are born, making sure that they are registered. Okay, another key issue for us is thinking about who particularly suffers from lack of identification. And what we know is that it primarily impacts the very poor. So for example, on the slide, if you look at the blue bars, you'll see this is just doing a comparison between the wealthiest people in sub-Saharan Africa, so just looking at the Africa region, but this separation between the wealthy and the poor we see across the globe. The blue bars indicate that of the richest people tend to be those that have more identification, and the poorest tend to be those that are most marginalized and lack identification. Another big gap is around gender, and in particular, women tend to be disenfranchised more, typically do not have identification. And again, just to give an example, it's about a 10% differential in the context of India between men and women. So these are two critical issues for us that we think about as both being able to address the most marginalized in the population, providing identity for them, inclusiveness with ID systems, and then also the gender aspects as well. Okay, so some of the lessons that we have to date around sort of good practices with identification systems are first to eliminate barriers. So some of the barriers that we see are issues of identification systems being linked to certain rights or entitlements. So if you're thinking about citizenship as being one of the requirements to receiving an ID, that tends to be one of the means by which many in the population, especially if you have folks that are refugees or others living in your country, that are then left out of the ID system. The other is, especially for large geographies, dispersed populations, is being able to have some sort of localized mobile enrollment process to make sure that you get as many people an ID as possible. The other are issues around women. So in some countries, you're required to either show a marriage license or to actually come to do your enrollment with your husband or another male figure. And then also from a cultural perspective, being able to have people who are doing enrollments also allow for all women, so that women are more, maybe culturally more comfortable with doing the enrollment process. The other area is around simplification. So not collecting 40 or 50 different data points in order to issue an ID, but rather maybe 4 or 5 of the most critical pieces of information. Also the flexible documentation, what you allow someone to present in order to identify themselves and receive a form of identification. And then this was also an issue that Annette raised around demand, and this is really critical. What is it that the person is going to receive in return for getting an ID? What's that ID going to enable him or her to do? And so they're motivated to enroll and to get an identification. And then the last is around the cost, especially for the very poor, thinking about ways in which you minimize, if not eliminate, the cost, especially when issuing that first form of identification. Okay, so now transitioning into the good ID area. So I'm going to cover a couple of things that we've been working on in this space to ensure that not only are we increasing the coverage, addressing that gap of 1 billion people, but also ensuring that those IDs are trusted and inclusive when they are rolled out. So to put sort of framework together of how we think about what a good ID would mean is we came up with a set of principles along with many other partners, which you can see listed on the screen. So most of the UN agencies, as well as the other regional development institutions, private sector, GSMA, as well as Secure Identity Alliance and other actors came together to come up with 10 core principles that we think about when working with countries on the design of their ID system. So these address issues around inclusion, around the design itself, and then related to governance. So some of the things that we're doing based upon those principles are first to look at the regulatory and legal environment in which the ID systems are operating. So these is a critical issue for us, particularly when we think about data privacy and protection. So one of the first things that the World Bank does when engaging with a country is to assess the legal and regulatory environment in that country and ensure that the proper data protection and privacy laws are in place before we will do any lending or financial support for a country in either enhancing or building out an ID system. So we've put together an assessment toolkit, which you can access through our website. It covers a number of key issues that we look at when analyzing or assessing the legal and regulatory environment in a country, the universality, the data protection. Often when rolling out a national ID, it's the first time a country has thought through some of the issues around data privacy and protection laws in a country. And the third is related to security. So the legal and regulatory is a key piece to ensuring that you have a robust ecosystem for identity. A second issue or area or opportunity that we see is around the technology itself. And so when you're designing an ID system, how can you use emerging technologies in order to enhance data privacy and protection? And so we've done some case studies on existing ID systems where they're deploying innovative approaches using technology such as tokenization. So you're not using the unique identification number for every transaction or to authenticate. Ways in which you provide the user with a portal by which he or she can see who's been accessing their ID and for what purposes. A third area that we work on is related to using technical standards, and Sanjay touched upon this as well. So this is a critical piece. As many of you will know, ID systems historically have had challenges with vendor lock-in issues, in part because of not using open standards, so often using proprietary solutions, which then creates challenges not only from a cost and performance perspective for the ID system itself, but also on interoperability. So if you want to link with your CR system or your voter registry, if you're not using open standards, it makes it a lot more difficult to have databases interact with one another. So this is just a catalog that we put together of existing standards that makes it easier, we hope, for a country when thinking about the design of a system to incorporate those standards. Another key issue that we see with ID systems is cost. And so in order to help countries sort of think through the decision-making process around the trade-offs between the type of system and the types of credentials they may be looking to use, we've pulled together an assessment of 15 countries and the key cost drivers when designing an ID system. And so some of the lessons that we've learned here, and maybe these are already well known to many of you, but the two main cost drivers for an ID system are the human resources, particularly when you're doing enrollment, but as well as operating the ID system itself. And then the second is the credential. So the credential, depending on how smart the card may be, that if you're issuing an actual physical credential, can really drive up costs. So that's two sort of key considerations that countries need to think about when designing an ID system. And on our website, there's an interactive tool by which you can put in some basic data points about your individual country, the coverage, the geography, and it'll allow you to come up with some cost estimates depending on the decisions that you put in. Whoops, sorry. Jumped ahead. Okay, and then the final document that I'll mention that we've just actually rolled out ahead of ID for Africa is what we call our practitioner's guide. So it's essentially the A to Z for practitioners working on identification. And so within this document, we cover all the content that I've just mentioned, but a number of other issues in a step-by-step process. This document we've just posted up on our website and are seeking feedback. So if you have interest, we would very much welcome you taking a look at what content's included in here as far as good practices around from the design of the ID system to the implementation to the ongoing management of the system itself. Okay, so moving on to the third area, which is around the importance of ID in the digital economy. So another question for the audience is, what do you think are the main use cases for an individual in a developing country using their ID for? What do you think most people use their ID for? Access services? What kind of services? I think I heard banking and healthcare. Anything else? Does anybody happen to have, I think I got one somewhere here, one of these in their pockets? Okay, the two main things that people use ID for are to register a SIM card, to get a mobile phone, and to open a bank account. So the Know Your Customer requires both of those, an individual to have a valid ID in order to get a mobile phone and to register or to open a bank account. The two primary ways in which people engage in the digital economy. So just another so this slide basically just touches upon the importance of ID in that context. The other thing that's critical to a digital economy is being able to identify yourself virtually. So in order to be able to transact online, you need to have some form of trusted digital identification. So we see the move to a digital economy as necessary globally, and that's a key platform or enabler for that that's critical is a digital identification. Okay, so just to wrap up, give you a sense of some of the work that we're doing and some of the focus we have going forward. So as Stephen mentioned in the introduction, we work with about 45 different countries, and we work with countries from the very early stage discussion around the existing ID system or the potential to build an ID system, so at the dialogue, all the way through to the financing and implementation of the ID system. So you'll see on the slide, those that are in yellow are countries that we've begun engagement over the last 12 months with, and you'll see also we're working both on the national ID as well as on civil registry, which is indicated by the CR. So we're active globally through a range of different interventions. And then this is the last slide, just to give you a sense of a couple of country examples. Unfortunately, our colleague from Nigeria, from NIMSI, was not able to join us, but Nigeria is a country where we've been working actively over the past 2 years in the development of a new foundational ID system for Nigeria, which is going to mobilize around $430 million in order to roll out that inclusive ID system. Another example in Somalia, we talked about the importance of civil registry. In Somalia, only roughly 3% of births are registered. So when you have such a large population without a birth registry, how do you think about designing an ID system? And in Somalia, as many of you know, is very dependent on remittances. And in order to get any sort of remittances or transfer of financial funds, you need to be able to show identity. So identity is really critical for a number of countries, including Somalia. In Morocco, just to mention, is an interesting case. They're going to be the first country to deploy what we call a modular open source identity platform, MOSIP. So this is an entirely open source ID system. It's going to be rolled out in Morocco over the next 12 months, and then the Philippines is also working on using this platform as well. So finding ways to create open systems that are modular and can be built upon. And then finally, just to conclude, to mention some of the work that we're doing in West Africa with a number of countries. So we work not just at the country level on the ID system, but then also on the interoperability across countries. So in the case of West Africa, actively working with ECOWAS, with the economic community in that region. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much, Seth. Very interesting. So, Seth is asking for feedback on the practitioner's guide. Please do. The work that World Bank are doing is very commendable, and I think anything that others around the world can do to help them in further their aims is going to be pretty good, and I look forward to seeing another version with feedback, some positive feedback from you. We've had a couple of questions come in already on the email, tripsymposium@icao.int. We have still some time left before you're going to be allowed out for your coffee. So I encourage anyone who's thinking there might be something they want to ask, you still have time to submit. So you've still got a few minutes left. To give you a chance, I'm just going to share a couple of thoughts with you. First of all, some good news. Despite our colleague from Nigeria not being able to make it, I've been informed that Mr. Aziz has provided his presentation, and that will be posted on the website tonight. So you'll be able to have a look at that later on. And secondly, just listening to these presentations, what's really struck me is that as a government official, I've always thought of ID as a means to make our borders and our travel secure. To me, that's always been the thing that's been our focus. But these presentations have really brought it home to me. They demonstrated that ID is a lot more than that. So words that I've noted here are empowerment, access to benefits, stopping disenfranchisement. These are benefits to the individual as well as to the state. And there's just something for me to take home and think about myself. I'm now going to see what questions we have. Annette is already ready to go. So I'm going to turn this microphone off and...
Okay, is it there? Okay, thank you very much. I've got a question that is saying that people are increasingly mobile, and what do you do if a person is born in one jurisdiction, married in another, and die in the third? What do you do in a case like that? So the first thing is that you need to have one single registry. That is what we did in Namibia. That obviously creates some political will, and there could be concern about data privacy, collecting all this data within one single database. So basically, you have to have will for that, and then you would need to formulate your legal framework that allows you to collect all these data under one profile. There is significant benefits for doing so, because when you then, if you have your birth record together with your marriage record, when you then come and apply for your ID, you just validate. You don't need to come with copy and certified copy to prove your identity, because the register will have that capability in form of the system. There's also another question for me.
Oh, well, carry on. You're on the roll.
Okay. So somebody's saying that if all vital events are recorded with the same, or can there be different assurance levels? For example, birth registered at hospital versus home that is reported by one of the parents. Okay, it's typical a question I'm often asking. What do you do to notify a birth if the birth occurs at home? So I'm just talking from the Namibian example now. So what we did, we said as long as the nurse, because most children are brought into the hospital or a clinic to get vaccination or have a health checkup immediately after birth. So as long as the nurse can guarantee that this woman gave birth to this child medically, she's allowed to notify, and that could be up to about 6 months. So they can notify. If that is not possible for them and they don't feel comfortable, you would have to present yourself in front of a registrar, and then you would have to provide other proof. So this also depends what kind of setting you are in. So I know there's also countries in South America where they have provided health assistance with mobile tabs that can notify. So there's different ways of doing it, and it also depends what type of network you have. So there's kind of different ways of doing it within your own country context. And that's always important. When you build this system, it's somehow you need to take your context into consideration. I don't know. Maybe there's some
Do either of Seth or Sanjay wish to comment on those questions? We've got some more, so don't feel you have to. Well, I was going to get in first with a question of my own, actually. So, Sanjay, listening to your presentation, you talked about the circle of trust was something I saw. Is there, and you may consider this a trick question, I don't know, but is there one particular segment from your circle of trust that you would say is more important than any of the others?
Yeah, I think that is a trick question. And if I could just answer it in this way. See, biometrics is definitely important, but biometrics is kind of restricted to ensuring the physical identity of the person. One of the points, if you had given me half an hour more to speak, I was going to make was that I think there are those two elements to identity which, things like civil registration bring out. One is the memories, what a person knows. That is where the social footprint comes in. So I think that, that process of memory, what a person knows, what is collectively known about him, is almost as important as biometrics, because that, brings out the entire person, not just the physical person. And that is the joke which I like to tell is, now it's legal identity, so it's, you talk to a lawyer that, okay, what's my identity? So he asks a trick question like you do. Are you talking about the legal person or the natural person? And I think somewhere, it's actually like a dualism, which both need to be kind of really factored into the identity, the legal identity and the physical identity of the person. I think both are equally important.
So, Seth, did you want?
Oh, no, I'm good. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, it was sort of a trick question. But I think maybe we can do a plug. Are you going to be at the regional seminar in Namibia next month? That's a shame, because you could have had your half an hour there. But never mind, you missed. Perhaps colleagues from ICAO are going to do a plug about that at some point during this week. We have some other questions that have been coming in as well. So a question for Sanjay. I'll come back to that one. We don't want you hogging everything. Let's move on to another one. We have a question. As more aspects of our lives are used as evidence of identities, such as social media or internet history, mobile phone, banking, biometrics, etc., can the panel address measures being taken to protect vulnerable or marginalized individuals from persecution by oppressive regimes, from using CVRs to target specific individuals or groups of individuals? I think, Seth, you talked about disenfranchisement and so on. Maybe I'll push this one to you first.
Sure. Yeah, thanks very much for the question. It's a super important issue, and one that we're looking into a great deal, and it was somewhat the driver for putting that ID environment enabling assessment tool together from the legal and regulatory perspective. I think this is a space where we still don't have a silver bullet to think about how you design an ID system that you can ensure is going to be inclusive as well as robust on the data protection and privacy aspects. I think there are some good practices that we are recommending at the moment, which one of them is the minimal data collection. So the idea that you're only collecting the necessary information in order to be able to uniquely identify that person to issue that unique identification number. Other mechanisms by which, so you're not collecting a lot of information. The other thing too is that if you have limited civil registration, and so for people getting a unique identification number, you need to collect biometrics, that those biometrics are stored in an encrypted way, and that when that individual goes to authenticate, that ideally you have a federated authentication system in place so that you're not always needing to check back to the central server for data about that individual. Also, other ways in which we noted in some of the work looking at the various technologies on tokenization, I think this is a space that's going to continue to evolve so that if you actually have your unique identification number, and colleagues from India can certainly talk about their experience with Aadhaar. Now you don't necessarily have to use your Aadhaar number for all your transactions. You can have a tokenized version, which is basically issuing you another number that you can use for banking purposes. You can get another number for health services or for your PDS, for your public distribution services, and so that you find ways in which you're masking that actual number so that you can't triangulate the data about an individual. But it is a real concern, and I think it's an area that's going to continue to evolve and something that we're focusing on even more as we go forward.
Do either of you have anything further to add on that? We have quite a few other questions just coming in now. So let's move on. So this is the question for Sanjay. How do you see the problem of legal multiple identities allowing people to legally carry and travel under different names, document types and identities? Evidence of identity does not prevent that each person is linked to just one identity? Yeah.
I think that's a very good question. I mean, that's kind of the central or the core question to this particular topic. And in some way, I mean, I can point out two processes which are ongoing, which are trying to, take on or, kind of address this particular issue. One is, okay, linking these systems that, okay, passport is linked to a birth, to the civil registration. And as you saw that those principles and objectives, one of them is that the identity is unique. So you are able to have, a kind of, as the word Seth used, the triangulation to arrive at, a single particular identity. A lot of the other issues are linked to it now, the dual citizenship and how, those will be. Now, but these are things which will, as these systems come closer to each other, I think these issues will have better ways of getting resolved. And the second is one of the important processes going on right now is the United Nations Legal Identity Expert Group. I think one of the objectives of these 7 or 8 UN agencies coming together is to try and arrive at a single definition of what should be, what will establish the legal identity of a person. So that is again another mechanism by which will help address this particular issue.
So we'll move on quickly because we're getting into coffee time now, but we've got some good questions. The next one, how do you establish identity in a host country when migrants and or refugees from an unknown third country arrive on your shores without any legal documentation? Annette, I think this one may be for you.
So the civil register has only got the responsible to register birth that occurs within your territory. So typical what will happen in a case like that is that you will have a separate database for refugees that obviously also have to be interoperable with your civil register and your ID register, because you don't want a penetration in either of the systems. You don't want locals to penetrate into the refugee system, which often happens because there's certain benefits there. But we also see refugees for, for getting better opportunity and maybe getting citizenship, trying to penetrate your civil register, your ID system. So it's two separate databases that need to be interoperable. I know, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the refugees or the UNHCR, but I know that there is a discussion about how do you create a legal identity for a refugee who comes from a state where there's no register or civil register or ID system. It is a great question, and that's what Sanjay actually spoke to. Who is allowed to create legal identity? Typical, it was only the register, civil register who was allowed to add, because a legal identity must, according to the principle, be created immediately after this birth has occurred. But what do you do in cases where this has not happened? Because people should obviously get a legal identity created at some point in life. So this is what Sanjay is saying, that now all these UN agencies are coming together, discussing what is legal identity and when can it be established, and who should have the right to create it.
Thank you. We've still got some more questions. I know we are over time. Oh, five minutes maybe? Oh, okay. So I'm going to put pressure on you now. I'm going to give you the question, and I want really quick, single-line answers if you can. So, first, how secure is the open source system in the Moroccan example? One word.
Secure, but I would say that it's, as with any open source system, the objective is to continue to enhance and improve. And so each time the system is rolled out, there'll be opportunities for that particular country and the integrator that they're working with to feed back new modules, new aspects to the system itself. So as with open source, it's intended to be a living platform that continues to get enhanced each time the system is used.
Thank you. That was admirably short. Thank you. I have another question here. What if the place up there is maybe wrong? Okay, I'm not sure we might have to come back to the individual that's asked one particular question here, because I'm not quite clear on what it means. So we've done that one. What we've got here. Okay, evidence of identity includes uniqueness. So accuracy plays an important role here, as all biometric systems have type 1 and type 2 errors. Sounds like someone's got some knowledge there. What adjudication best practices exist for the remainder? Does anyone feel able to answer that one? Oh, okay.
Yeah, no problem. So it's very important, obviously, that that there is an adjudication measure in which redressal can be process for individuals that, particularly, so for instance, in the case of India with Aadhaar, it's had huge cost savings to the government in rolling out their food subsidies initiative. Estimates around $13 billion a year in cost savings. At the same time, those food subsidies are going to the very poor, the most poor and most vulnerable in the population. So if you're authenticating using your biometrics and you need to be able to, if you have some error rates, there needs to be proper redressal in order to ensure that those most marginalized still get their food subsidies. And so countries need to put mechanisms in place in order to ensure that if there is an authentication error, that it doesn't lead to not receiving your services.
Could I just add here on the way? Yeah, that is why, coming back to the circle of trust, biometrics, biographics, and social footprint.
Thank you very much. We do have other questions that have still been coming in, but as some of you, the observant among you may have noticed, Denis was grabbing my arm and he was issuing all sorts of nasty threats, actually. I didn't know he was that sort of guy. So if your question's not been answered here, I understand our panel should be around for the rest of the day, most of the rest of the day. Please seek them out and ask them. I'm sure they'll be delighted. Some of the questions here are quite tricky. So probably need a longer answer than we've got time for here. So thank you very much. Thank you to our presenters. And over to you, Denny.
And thank you very much, Steve, for a couple of reasons. One, to having gotten the day off to a great start, and second, it's always delightful to have this balance between substance and humor. So to you and to your group, thank you very much for an excellent first session today. Thank you. Yes, coffee break right now, brought to you by Emperor Technologies. Yesterday they made a presentation. They said that they had a few gifts to give out at their booth just on the right here. I checked a few moments ago, limited quantities left. If you want your gift, just on the right as you go out the assembly hall, they have a few more. If not, we'll see you around 11. Enjoy the networking coffee break. Thank you.